Welcome to the FT Business Clinic live, coming at you from the FT in London. I'm Claer Barrett, the FT's personal finance editor, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by my longtime colleague Jim Pickard, who is our chief political correspondent from the Westminster team, and we are going to be talking about reaction to Rishi Sunak's summer statement last week. A large package of stimulus measures were unveiled in an effort to revive the UK economy. Obviously, the figures this morning about GDP haven't given us much confidence that that recovery is going to be V-shaped. It looks like it's going to be more of a protracted long haul. But nevertheless, there's lots that we want to discuss with you about those measures. If you're running a business, what do you think of them? Do you think the Chancellor should have done something else? Should he have gone further? And as for the impact that those measures are already having on the economy and on the different markets, we'll be looking at that. Now, if you have already left a question, if you've looked at the story on ft.com, we've got all of those, and I can get live questions fed through to me from the YouTube and the LinkedIn screen, which will pop up on my iPad. So if you want to make a point or ask either me or Jim a question, we'll be live online for the next roughly half an hour, and we would love to hear from you. So do get in touch. But in the meantime, Jim, let's start with a few questions for you. So for the benefit of people who are watching, could you just give us the top lines of the main stimulus measures that were announced last Wednesday in the Chancellor's summer statement?
So Rishi Sunak's statement last Wednesday had £30 billion worth of announcements and pledges. I think the biggest one at face value is this pledge to pay companies £1,000 for every single worker that they bring off the government's furlough scheme by January. And given that we have 9 million people currently on furlough, the potential price tag on that one policy alone is up to £9 billion, incredibly. And we can talk a bit later about companies like Primark and John Lewis who've turned this down, saying that they don't actually need it. But this is potentially the biggest, most expensive policy from the summer statement. And then we have the one with the stamp duty, where people paying stamp duty, I think through till next spring, won't pay anything up to £500,000, and which means that something like 90% of housing transactions will have no stamp duty at all. And it also means people buying properties above that threshold also get to pay less stamp duty than they normally would. And then there was a lot of stuff targeted at employment, particularly for young people. There's not only £1,000 per trainee that companies take on, there's also basically a new payment system so that something like 300,000 young people can be taken on for 6 months, and the government will basically pay all of their salary for that period, which is a very much a new thing and quite ambitious. And then I suppose, lastly, the way to look at this is measures targeted specifically at one industry, which is hospitality/tourism, but particularly the UK tourism industry. And they benefited from two things. They had firstly the VAT cut from 20% to 5%, cafes, restaurants, hotels, etc. And then we also had the Rishi's dishes, not his designation, but Fleet Street likes a good nickname, whereby the government will literally subsidize us all to eat out for the whole month of August, although not every day. I think it's Monday through to Wednesday. And very disappointingly, alcoholic drinks are excluded from Rishi's special deal. But, on the face of it, a lot of surprises there, adding up to a fair amount of money, £30 billion. But we should put into context that £30 billion comes after the government has already spent £160 billion since March trying to boost the economy because of the coronavirus pandemic. And so it doesn't necessarily mark an acceleration of assistance. It's kind of more a continuation, I would say.
Absolutely, and a continuation for different bits of the economy that the Chancellor thinks need that extra boost, like the hospitality industry, like retaining people in their jobs if they have been furloughed, getting that bonus of £1,000 per worker for bringing them back. But I think one of the biggest question marks for readers that have already been leaving questions for us to answer on ft.com comes with the stamp duty stimulus measure. Lots of people saying, first-time buyers, they used to have an advantage with the stamp duty holiday, but of course now this applies to everyone, even buy-to-let landlords, of which we have many FT readers who are buy-to-let landlords, either by accident or by design. They will also feel the benefit. They'll still pay a 3% surcharge, but for somebody buying a £500,000 home, if you were just buying for your main residence, the maximum that you would save in stamp duty would be £15,000 because you wouldn't pay any stamp duty. But if you were a landlord, instead of getting a £30,000 stamp duty bill for that property, it would be halved to 15,000. So still a significant tax boost for the landlords there, admittedly, after they've had a pretty tough time over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a sort of U-turn if you think about it in terms of where the movement has been over the last few years. It has been not a sign kind of violent sudden turning against landlords, but the fiscal system by successive chancellors. Osborne began this, I think, and Philip Hammond continued it, just sort of adding on those extra payment charges for landlords and also removing some of the reliefs that they used to enjoy in an attempt to try and boost the first-time buyers, which has become very much a political issue, a political problem for the Conservative Party, given how many people under the age of 30 or even under the age of 40 is now struggling to buy a home. And so you're right, that this is a sudden sort of change. It benefits landlords to quite a considerable degree. And I think it just reflects the fact that we're in such a difficult position. We're in a position where the entire economy is at risk of not just recession, but perhaps the biggest depression in a century. And therefore, I think the view is if we can get investment into any industry, including property, right now, the political question of whether the government should be helping first-time buyers over landlords, they can kind of park that to one side where they just try and get transactions moving, because a lot of the economy, estate agents, the surveyors, if you think about the DIY market and retail and people move into a new home, they then go out and buy a load of pot plants or carpets or furniture. There's a lot of economic activity around the property market that they're just desperate to stimulate as fast as possible.
Well, the great thing about doing these live videos on the FT is that we can hear from you. You can have your say. So maybe you're an estate agent, a chartered surveyor, perhaps you're somebody who works in the property industry, a builder, perhaps you're just somebody who's looking to move house, or somebody who has a view on being a buy-to-let landlord, or even a tenant of a buy-to-let landlord. Whatever the case, you can leave your comments in the live stream. They'll get to me on my iPad, and we can put them to Jim. So, Jim, more generally, away from stamp duty, the other measures that Rishi Sunak announced, particularly the furlough scheme, help for the hospitality industry, and trying to improve the employment prospects for this so-called lost generation of young people who are coming up. I mean, these are all very worthy problems. What's been the reaction to those measures so far?
So I think that politically, we're in a very interesting time where the Labour Party, who would normally accuse the Conservatives of parsimony and failing to spend enough money and not intervening aggressively enough to stave off economic collapse, they've kind of been silenced, really, because a lot of the things that Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Chancellor, has done have been more ambitious than either Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, or Annalisa Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, have been calling for. I mean, they would say they were pushing for the furlough scheme back in the spring, which was true. But I think when Rishi Sunak extended it all the way through to the end of October, that was not actually something that Labour had called for. And the reason for that is because they are still worried about having this sort of spendthrift reputation and being the party that spends huge amounts of money. But they are sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, because trying to sound kind of fiscally responsible right now is when so much money is required to stave off the problems we're facing, it means they don't have a lot to say. I suppose where they are trying to distinguish themselves is by saying there should be specific help for some sectors like aerospace or automotives, or maybe more help for hospitality. But yeah, the politics of this for now are that Rishi Sunak, very popular, and people quite impressed with what he's doing. In 6 months' time or 12 months' time, that's going to look very different. But we can come back to that. I think the other point on the specific measures is that certainly, I mean, I was in the newsroom at FT headquarters on Wednesday writing the online splash. And when I heard this £1,000 payment for every furloughed worker who comes, on the face of it, I thought it sounded incredible, like a really ambitious, great program. And then you think about it, right? And you think, well, would a company really stop itself from sacking someone just for £1,000? Question mark. And then you look at the deadweight cost, which is that even on the most depressing predictions, economists still presume that 6 or 7 of the furloughed people are going to come back anyway. So are you actually paying this money to companies who wouldn't be sacking these people anyway? And I think that's why John Lewis said they wouldn't take the money. Primark said it's not going to take the money. And you've got companies like, I think McDonald's is in line for a potential £100 million of cash. And people are going to ask, well, were you McDonald's going to re-employ them anyway? In which case, why are you taking taxpayers' money for nothing? But I think on the apprenticeship stuff and the trainee stuff, I think there's not much to criticise. What do you think of Rishi's dinners, Claire?
Well, as somebody who loves a money-saving wheeze, I do think that any measure to increase business at local restaurants has to be a good idea. So this is going to be Monday to Wednesday throughout August, but you have to eat in. You can't use it for takeaway. Now, that for me is a problem because I don't feel ready to go and sit in a restaurant yet for an extended period of time and eat. I'm quite happy to go and buy takeaways and support our local businesses that I can bring back to eat at home or eat al fresco in the local park. So I think it's very interesting because people are obviously going to be weighing saving money against how safe is it to go into places. Obviously, from next week, or the week after next, we'll all have to wear masks when we go inside a shop. But you can't really wear a mask inside a restaurant because you can't get anything in your mouth.
It's a really interesting point you make, Claire. I mean, absolutely spot on that, there's potentially a massive deadweight cost here as well, because if the only people who are going to take advantage of this bog-off meal offer are people who would be going to restaurants throughout August anyway, then you're just giving money to people who would have got it anyway, I suppose. And if people are too afraid to go to restaurants, this probably isn't going to change their minds. I think as well, there's the limit to how many meals out you can have, even in the August summer holidays. So we'll see. But I think the cost of that policy is only £500 million. So in the scheme of things, it gets very good headlines. It doesn't actually cost much compared to the rest of the interventions.
And absolutely, it will be a big boost for independent restaurateurs, people running pubs who, let's face it, have really suffered in this crisis. Have had 3 months or more of absolutely zero income coming in. Same goes for the VAT. Lots of people were asking straight after, well, will I get a discount on my holiday now that this VAT discount is coming in? And that wasn't my expectation. My expectation was that this was to help the businesses rather than the consumers. Because let's face it, we're all desperate for a holiday anyway. If we can still afford to go on holiday, we've got money in the bank. Certainly the savings rate for people who haven't unfortunately lost their job or been hit by the reduction in pay from the furlough scheme, we should be happy to pay the hoteliers the price that we would expect to pay, and for them to keep some of that difference, I think, because they've had to come up against such great adversity just to keep going. And we'll have a very, very reduced summer season. And it's a very seasonal business. If you're
there was a lot of talk as well, wasn't there, about potentially the government doing retail vouchers, so basically sort of helicopter drop of money, so every household has 50 quid or 100 quid to spend in shops. Do you think that would have been the kind of thing he should be doing, or maybe doing the autumn statement?
Well, they were talking about £500, the Resolution Foundation. This was a think tank that set out some sort of like creative ways that the government could help. Now, whether he will come to that in the autumn statement to boost demand further, I don't know. But one of the things I thought was, well, if you give it to retailers, and let's face it, there wasn't much help for retail in the summer statement, and retail has been suffering too. If you give a boost like that to the retailers, you can't really differentiate it between spending on the high street, which is what I suspect the government wants to encourage more than anything, and spending online, which of course has absolutely rocketed under lockdown, with frankly no help from the government needed there at all. But all of the store closures that we saw announced last week are really reflecting the fact that the cost of doing business on the high street no longer reflects the profits that retailers can generate there. And to see big names like John Lewis and Boots saying they're going to close down scores of stores, make lots of redundancies, was frankly quite shocking. But let's come to some of the reader questions that have been pouring in on this subject. Predictably, stamp duty has got the most. So a question from a reader who's called FT Reader, nice original name there. Jim, do you foresee the stamp duty holiday being extended beyond the current deadline? So it's 8 months until the end of March at the moment, because they say it may take buyers some time to consider their their new purchases and get all of the paperwork done with a sometimes lengthy process of completion. What do you think about that? Others are saying, will there be a big drop off in prices when the stamp duty holiday ends?
Hmm. So I think on whether they would continue it, I obviously can't answer that question specifically, but I can put it into the context of the fact that we're going to have tax rises coming down the tube at some point within the next year or two. And I'm not suggesting that the entire £350 billion deficit that we're going to have for this financial year will be funded in that way. Let's be clear, most of that is going to be funded through borrowing with the help of QE by the Bank of England. But the expectation, and in Rishi Sunak's team have made it quite clear, there need to be some tax rises and a few spending cuts as well. And the IFS last week said to the government, please don't do that straight away. Please don't do that in your autumn budget. Please leave it a year or two until the economy is back into something approaching full health. But I think the Chancellor is tempted to get on with some tax rises in the autumn. So I think in that context, you have to think that the extension of the stamp duty holiday beyond the spring is very, very unlikely.
Excellent. Very good answer, Jim. I just have to read out very, very good comment from concerned number 2, an FT reader who says the stamp duty holiday is a political stunt and nothing more. You say that there has been a sugar rush. The market will likely crash, as in the come down with any sugar rush. So interesting view there. So next question comes from FT reader Harvey Rules. He said, is there any indication yet of whether the Scottish government may cut stamp duty? I should have pointed out at the top of this item that the stamp duty cuts we're talking about only applied to England and Northern Ireland. Well, Harvey, I can tell you the Scottish government did move to cut stamp duty yesterday. In fact, it was announced, but they are cutting their version of it, the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, a lot less. The threshold will rise to £250,000, whereas in England and Northern Ireland, the threshold before the tax kicks in is now £500,000. And the maximum saving that you would be able to generate as a buyer would be just over £2,000 in Scotland. So very different from the £15,000 potential saving if you bought an expensive property in London or the southeast.
Does that partly reflect the fact that Scottish property prices are just so much lower than certainly the southeast of England?
Yes, it could be. I mean, as you know, Jim, the Scottish property system is entirely different from England and Wales. There are, offers over. It's like a sealed bid process when you buy a property. I've never bought a property in Scotland, but I know a lot of estate agents up there, and it does seem to be a fairer system. Now, one thing which I suspect is going to start happening in England and Northern Ireland, if it hasn't already, with the stamp duty changes, is that buyers may be kind of more galvanized to stick to their asking price, or maybe even try and get a bit more if there are more buyers in the market. Because we've got plenty of readers talking about how they feel that they're going to be up against their landlords and second-time buyers, next steppers, even downsizers, people looking to sell a large family home, move into a smaller property. I mean, one such case, FT readers S&R, my partner and I are first-time buyers. We've been saving for a deposit to buy our first and hopefully last family home together. We're looking at a budget of around £600,000. And they're not finding much on the market that meets their requirements. They say, have house prices adjusted upwards already to take the stamp duty holiday into account? Is there a chance that prices will settle or even drop after March next year? Well, obviously, quite tough for first-time buyers who've made up a huge proportion of sales and transactions in the market over the last year to now really be feeling the heat from other buyers, maybe not so much investors because they still have some stamp duty to pay, but certainly from second or third time buyers who can now trade up without having to pay any tax.
But I think that rush of people to the door is a lot of that's pent up demand, because bear in mind that the entire market was put on hold for, was it 4 months? And so a lot of people who were looking at buying in January, February, March are now cracking on with that. I think in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, that might have worn off. And I wouldn't really expect a sort of frenzied residential property market to continue that long just off the back of this one thing. I mean, we're still talking about cost at the margins. I guess the difference is that stamp duty, you have to actually pay it as cash, don't you? I don't think. Can you add it to your mortgage, Claire?
You can, if your mortgage lender is sympathetic, then you can borrow some or all of the amount of stamp duty that you have to pay. Obviously, you've then got to pay interest on that money over the same period of time as your loan. So it's if you know, you shouldn't really be putting money aside.
So on a bit on a London property then, where you're saving £15,000 off £1 million home, we're still only talking about 1%, aren't we? So,
yeah. I know it's frightening, isn't it? So lots of comments coming in from people who are watching us on LinkedIn. Hello there to everybody on LinkedIn. We have Tiago who says, what will be the implications on overall prices in the market? Will we observe some adjustments around the £500,000 threshold at which the stamp duty kicks in? And he thinks that first-time buyers will definitely be worse off. Then another LinkedIn user, Carl Greisel, says, is the government even considering rebating any stamp duty paid in the past few weeks or months to those buyers who have, as you said, Jim, gone through that wave of pent-up transactions? Well, the short answer to that one, Carl, is unfortunately not, no. It came in immediately from last Wednesday on the day of the summer statement. If you are in the throes still of a property transaction, i.e. if you have exchanged and not yet completed, then solicitors tell me that you will get the stamp duty discount, providing you complete before the end of March, because it's the completion that is the date that counts. But if you completed before last Wednesday, then unfortunately the savings are not there for you.
Can I answer the first question? I think the first question would be valid if the system of stamp duty had a cliff edge whereby at £499,000 you paid no stamp duty, and at £501,000 you were suddenly hit with a bill for 5, 10, 20 grand. But obviously you're only applying stamp duty to the residual bit over. So on the £501,000 deal, you're only paying the 5% stamp duty on that £1,000. That's right?
Absolutely.
So I wouldn't see any distortionary effect around the threshold particularly.
I mean, certainly the early data from estate agents and property portals like Rightmove is that searches have hit all-time highs. People are now definitely thinking, you know, if we had plans to move that we put on hold, can we reactivate them? And I think definitely if there are any estate agents out there, we'd love to hear what you say. So just moving away from property for a moment, we've had quite a few questions from younger readers. I'll start with Richard Gunther on YouTube. He says, Jim and Claire, do you think that the government will give any support for university students? So far, we've been left out of any specific help measures while our loans carry on ballooning. And end of university prospects, i.e. getting a job as a graduate, are declining. Well, that is a really, really good question, Richard. I really feel for university students who are, you know, reduced to doing seminars over Zoom, often having to pay for student accommodation, which they are no longer living in, various different reactions from student landlords and universities about giving people rebates. And now looking into the autumn term, it's still very uncertain about whether university life can carry on as it has been. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could bring you some kind of good news or optimism from the world of politics, but I agree, it is looking very bleak. And I think the Treasury stock answer to a lot of this stuff is, you know, we have provided lots of macro schemes to business. We're trying to prop up the economy in various different ways, and there's only so much we can do. I mean, there was a point earlier in the year where they did provide some money for universities, not specifically to students, but to the institutions of the universities, because they were complaining that their financial health was in deep peril. And they did in the end get some money, but whether that's enough over the medium term is obviously a whole different question.
Absolutely. And I would say, Richard, I did one of these videos, which you can find on the FT's YouTube channel, with Isabel Berwick, the Working Careers editor, a couple of weeks ago. And she had loads of really good suggestions for graduates and other people who are back in the jobs market looking for work. Because, of course, let us not forget, moving on to our next question, that we've got more than 9 million people in the UK at the moment who are on furlough. And one of the biggest questions is how many of those furloughed jobs will turn into jobs that are made redundant. Obviously, a big worry for workers and a big problem for employers, many of whom will be watching. So this question is from FT reader Alana. She says, Claire and Jim, can you discuss what it will mean when people who are on furlough move to unemployment and the universal credit system? From what I understand is that it will economically be a large hit to income and consumption. That is also a government policy, first to end furlough and second, not to make universal credit more generous in any way. So just a couple of small points on universal credit before I hand over to Jim. The government has made it slightly more generous at the outset of the pandemic, and they've certainly put a lot more resources into helping people to be able to claim it, because we have seen a huge rise in the numbers of people who are interacting with the system. And I did write a column in the FT a couple of weeks ago dealing with a question I had from a friend who was saying, hang on a minute, how come I can't get anything from universal credit? And it was because she had, or rather her partner had, savings. Now, a lot of people don't realise that the level of savings that you have as a household can actually reduce or even stop your entitlement to means-tested benefits like universal credit, no matter how long you've been a taxpayer for, no matter how long you've been paying into the system. Things like job seekers allowance tend to be non-means tested, and you'll be able to get those for a limited amount of time. But lots of workers, unfortunately, Jim, are finding that there isn't much of a cushion from the benefit system compared to the generosity of the furlough scheme, where 80% of their pay, up to £2,500 a month, has been provided. So, definitely some big income shocks ahead.
Yeah, and I think one of the side effects of the furlough scheme, looking back at when that was introduced, it was an incredibly audacious policy. There were similar policies around the world which Rishi Sunak and his team looked at, for example, Canada and some European countries, but they were not as generous at all. I think 80% at the time was definitely the most generous job support scheme in the world. I remember talking to Carolyn Fairbairn about this, who was the leader of the CBI business group. And she said to me, she had chief executives of big FTSE 100 companies crying on the phone to her with relief, because it was such an emotional time and they were worried that they were going to have to lay off so many people. And the Chancellor and the Treasury had managed to stop it, but averted is probably a better verb, because by October, and we'll see more before then, because there's a sort of gradual process whereby companies start paying a contribution towards the furlough payments. It begins, I believe, in August with national insurance and pension contributions, and then the employers have to start paying a proportion of the pay as well. Until the end of October, the whole thing is taken away. And this phenomenal, historic, impressive employment safety net being withdrawn entirely. And I can see why a lot of people are going to find that very, very difficult, going from pretty much close to what they were earning before to the universal credit, which is by no means particularly generous. But the view in the Treasury would be, having spent all this money already and anticipating a doubling in unemployment, to increase the universal credit in any meaningful way would it wouldn't technically break the bank, but they would consider it being something that's literally just not affordable. And once you increase the universal credit, you're not politically going to be able to put it back down again in 6 months' time or 18 months' time. So there would be a lot of resistance to that, unfortunately. Okay,
well, I'm just going to whip through some other questions that we've had coming in live from people who are watching on YouTube and also on LinkedIn. Firstly, I'll start with Susan Reed, who says, Claire, I love your room, your guitar and your music. I have strayed from television as well. Thank you. Well, Susan, you've made my day. Thank you very much for that. James Elway on YouTube, he says, now, do you believe now is a good time to be a first-time buyer? We'll come back to that one in a second. A humorous comment from FT reader IKN. He says, do you think that if aliens landed and threatened to destroy every house in England, that the government would respond by pumping more money into the housing market? Well, hopefully we won't ever see that one happen, IKN. We also have a comment from LinkedIn user Sorry, I've lost the place on my. I have link from LinkedIn user. I know Chris Giles cited the UK VAT cut after the last crisis as evidence to support how it was needed. But what are your thoughts on how it will fare this time? And finally, Sophia Petrides on LinkedIn says the government should do a better job supporting small startup businesses. Well, certainly we've covered the woes of the small business owners many times on these videos. Better job of supporting small startup businesses, Jim. What are your views on that? They've done quite a lot of different measures, I have to say, from the bounce back loan to all of the things that were announced last Wednesday.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound like a Treasury official here when I say that if you look at the amount of money that's gone through the door, you think of the fact that business rates have been deferred, the big VAT deferral, 4 different kinds of loan schemes. Obviously, not all of those for small business. 3 of them are for quite large. Well, so 2 of them are for quite large companies. But the bounce back scheme that Claire just mentioned, they put out £30 billion through the door to 1 million borrowers. I was drinking in the park 2 nights ago with a friend whose her advisory business had, they were able to borrow £35,000, and it's literally saved them from collapse, at least for a year or so. The government would say they've done an awful lot. I think it's inevitable that they're going to have people knocking on their door increasingly as we go forward and as these things are withdrawn. And it'll be less a question of who's been left out so far who needs help, and it's more which of the people who currently get help from the government are going to need some kind of new help from them to avoid entire industries going to the wall.
Okay, and just coming back to James Elway's comment, do you believe now is a good time to consider buying if you're a first-time buyer? Well, James, as we've been discussing today, you face a lot more competition in the property market now. The first-time buyer's discount on stamp duty has been superseded by a stamp duty cut for everyone, but it's only a temporary cut, whereas the first-time buyer cut presumably will continue as it did past March. So you may find, if you hang on, not only will market conditions move more in your favour, but also you'll be able to save up a larger deposit. And Jim, one thing we haven't talked about so far is the attitude of the mortgage lenders in this crisis, because we've seen a lot of the higher loan to value products, 95% mortgages have been pulled. Many mortgage lenders have more recently come back in with 90% products, so you'd still need a 10% deposit or more in order to get a loan and obviously meet the affordability requirements. But there's a lot of nervousness amongst mortgage lenders about redundancies. What will happen in October? How high will that level get? Because of course that's the biggest threat to being able to repay your mortgage. And we've got around 1 in 6 people with a mortgage in the UK at the moment who've taken advantage of the government's offer to defer payments for 3 to 6 months, which is quite an incredible figure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the positive things that's come out of the stamp duty cut already, is lenders such as Nationwide, who had cut their maximum LTV, lifting it back up again in the case of Nationwide to 90%. I think, I used to be the property correspondent for the FT 15 years ago. Some viewers won't know that, which is where I first met Claire. We were both writing about property back in those days. And we were both covering property at the time of the crazy, was it 105% loan to value mortgage that Northern Rock came up with?
120%, some of them were.
Yeah, so it's good that we haven't gone anywhere like back to those crazy days. I think, to answer the question from the person asking about, is it a good time to be a first-time buyer? I think, just to think about this in macro terms, there are 3 main drivers to property prices into the UK housing market. The first is demographics, which is not enough homes have been built compared to household formation and growing population over the last 20 years. And that has been one of the things that has so far pushed up prices. I think the other thing is interest rates. And when I was writing for the FT about property, I was probably too bearish for quite a long time. I mean, in the end, I was proved right because there was the financial crash that we all know about because of the property crash. But for several years, I was sort of wrong-footed because I underestimated the extent to which interest rates, being at rock bottom, were this massive driver of borrowing through mortgages for the property market. And, when I first bought a flat 20 years ago, I was paying something like 5% on my mortgage. 10 years before that, it was normal to pay 10%. And we now have, what is it, Claire, 1 or 2% or whatever it is. And I think interest rate prospects right now are obviously, how do I phrase this? This is not financial advice, but it's almost impossible to envisage a scenario where interest rates go up for the near term. I can't imagine how on earth that could happen. But the third factor, which hasn't been relevant during our working journalistic life, is employment, because employment for the last 20 years has been basically full or close to full. But if you think about the 1980s or you think about previous decades, if unemployment goes from around 1.5 million or whatever it was a few months ago, if that goes up to about 4 million, which is the central assumption of Downing Street, then you have an awful lot of people who are going to struggle to pay their mortgages, who may have to downsize, who may have to switch to renting, who, if they don't own a house now, they're not going to suddenly buy a house. And so if those economic forecasts of the highest unemployment, certainly in our adult lifetime, are true, then that's going to be a major headwind, to say the very least, for the property market.
Absolutely. Very well put, Jim. Thank you for explaining that to us. Now, we're slightly over time, but I've got one final question that I'm going to ask to you, because we're very lucky to have you on the show today, which concerns looking ahead to the autumn budget. So, of course, all of the measures from the summer statement that we've discussed today, they were kind of like, an extra stimulus for the UK economy, but there were growing expectations, certainly among FT Money readers, that by the time of the autumn budget, which we're expecting will be in November, the Chancellor may start to outline or even implement some measures that go towards how we are going to pay for all of this largesse.
Yeah, so what the Conservative manifesto ahead of the last election in December said was that there'd be this triple promise where they wouldn't put up the main taxes of, what was it, income tax, was the other one VAT and
the triple lock on the state pension increase.
Yeah, so the triple lock on state pension increase is something that they are going to break. So that's the one whereby the state pension would have to go up by either a set amount, or is it inflation? And what's the other one?
Inflation, wage growth, or 2.5%, whichever is the higher of the three.
Exactly.
And it's the wage growth one that's going to be the problem, ironically.
So they don't want to break that promise. So instead of breaking that promise, they're going to temporarily suspend it, probably for a couple of years, which will save them a bit of money. But it's a bit confusing because there's two triple locks. There's the pension triple lock, and then there's the tax triple lock, where you don't put up your three main taxes. But as you all know, there are a zillion ways of raising tax through things that people are less aware of, or vaguely aware of, or only find out about when they read them in the Red Book. And I don't know whether there'll be massive tax rises in the autumn. I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies has a point that, if the economy is still in a really rocky state, you don't want to be deterring consumption, expenditure, investment. You want to be doing the opposite. But at the very least, there will be some signals to tax rises around the corner. And I think, on the other hand, we'll probably need to do some more stuff to support employment. The business groups, a lot of the business groups want to cut to national insurance for companies when they employ new employees. That voucher idea for high streets, if the high street's still in desperate straits, you could see something like that. Whether there's going to be sector-specific support for industries like aerospace that are in deep trouble, I don't know. I think it's very difficult to do you get accused of cherry picking if you support one industry and not another. So predicting what will happen in the autumn is very hard. All we know is that he's going to have mounting questions about how on earth he pays for everything, and mounting questions about why he isn't still borrowing huge amounts of money to keep us all afloat.
Well, thank you very much there, Jim. I think we've definitely got our money's worth out of you today. That's Jim Pickard, the FT's chief political correspondent, taking time out to speak to us from his very busy day job. Thank you so much as well to all of the readers who've been online and have been asking questions. If we didn't have time to get to your question, I may have avoided it because it was similar to another one or a bit too technical. There are a couple that have flashed up on YouTube in particular, which I will direct you to some other FT articles, which I hope can answer your questions. And we will post links on YouTube and LinkedIn and at the bottom of the FT.com article to some of the other pieces that we referenced today about stamp duty and things that Jim has written about the reaction to Rishi Sunak's summer statement last week in general. But until then, next Tuesday, we'll be back with another person in the hot seat. We'll see you then, 12 noon UK time. I'm Claer Barrett. I hope to see you next week on the Business Clinic.